Well, hey everyone, welcome back to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host, and for this episode, I'm interviewing Monica Wood, author of the book The One in a Million Boy. And as early as now, you can go to the Amazon link in the video description below and check out Monica's book. So, Monica, welcome. Great to have you here on AuthorStory.
Thank you, Alex. I'm very happy to be here.
All right, cool. So, Monica, tell us about yourself. Specifically, did you ever think you'd become a novelist like you are now?
I grew up in a little mill town in the state of Maine where we didn't really have a lot of access to, that kind of culture, honestly. But my oldest sister, who's 13 years older than I am, was a high school English teacher in the local school. And it was a little town called Mexico, Maine, and she taught English at Mexico High School. And so she was a great model for me. In fact, she was the first person I ever remember telling me that there was such a thing as a writer. And I think she saw early on in me that that was what my path was going to be. I actually am a little bit of a late bloomer. I didn't honestly start in earnest until I was in my late 20s, but I always wrote as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult. So it's always been there.
So what did you write, like essays, or did you get right onto short stories and stuff like that?
It was almost always fiction. Almost always, yeah. I mean, now I do a little bit of everything, but as a kid, it was, making up little stories about animals and things. And then I was really into Nancy Drew as a kid. I'd write my own Nancy Drew novels with a character named Nancy Drew, but it wasn't the Nancy Drew. So so there were little things like that. And then I wrote poetry for a little while, but I always have had an attraction to the written word.
Okay, interesting. And when did you get your first novel out? I mean, when was it written? When was it published?
It was 1993, and I was 39 years old. So that was my first one. And then all through my 40s, I published a lot. So this book, The One in a Million Boy, is my 6th book. And I also have some books for aspiring writers. There's a little 2-volume series called The Pocket Muse, which is they're kind of little cute little very nicely done. They have photographs and writing prompts and little tips and tricks and things like that. They're done by F&W Publications, and they do a lot of writing books and things. So there's that too. And I do some magazine work, but really, writing novels is my main pursuit. And so I have, this is my, let me see, 1, 2, 3. This is my 5th novel, and I also have a memoir, and I also have a play. So a little bit of everything.
All right, cool. So this is kind of interesting for me, because I mean, not many people at the age of 39 would think of writing a novel. I mean, how did that particular book come about?
That one I had been working on actually for quite a while. And it started with a short story. I was writing a lot of short stories when I first started out, and I got a couple of those published. And then the first novel I thought was going to be a short story. And I call it the short story that ate Chicago. I mean, it just became this giant horror story of a short story. And then I realized very belatedly that I was actually writing a novel.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Okay. So let's get to The One in a Million Boy. What inspired you to write this novel?
I honestly don't know, but some stories sort of arrive ready-made, and this felt like one of them. To summarize it, the novel revolves around a friendship between a 104-year-old Lithuanian immigrant woman named Ona Vitkus and an 11-year-old Boy Scout who is doing her chores every Saturday to earn a merit badge in community service. And this little boy is completely obsessed with the Guinness records and convinced his elderly friend to go for a world record of longest lived person. Now, on 2 of the novel, the reader discovers that this boy has recently died of a 1 in a million genetic heart condition. And in his place, to this woman's doorstep on the next Saturday, arrives Quinn Porter, who's a 42-year-old professional guitar player, the boy's divorced father. And he has been guilted into completing his son's commitment to this old woman by Belle, his twice ex-wife, who is the little boy's mother. So it's the story between Quinn and Ona that drives the plot of the novel. But the boy, even though he's gone at the beginning of the story, is a main character. So we meet him through flashback scenes. We meet him through a series of recordings he has done with his elderly friend for a school project. And in those recordings, the reader comes to understand that they were very good friends. It was a real friendship. And that in fact, this woman has confided to this child things she has never told anybody in her 104-year-old life.
Okay, very interesting, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly interested in Ona Vitkus, the Lithuanian woman, because I mean, there aren't that many centenarian characters, you know, in fiction.
No,
that's
very true.
Like, just off the top of my head, the only centenarian plus aged people I can think of in books are, like, you know, in the Old Testament, the Bible, all those patriarchs and all those 100-plus-year-old guys.
They were a long-lived crowd there in the Old Testament. Yes. Yeah. So, it's funny, when I was a kid in this little town that I lived in, we lived on we called them blocks. They were triple-decker apartment buildings. We lived on the 3rd floor, and we had a Lithuanian lady who was our landlady, and she and her husband, and they were very elderly even at the time I was a child, and they lived very late into their 90s. And it seemed all the Lithuanians in town did. We had a kind of a very immigrant town because people came for the paper mills. So we had like an Italian neighborhood, and an Irish neighborhood, and a Lithuanian neighborhood, and French Canadian neighborhood, and so it was kind of a little melting pot of those types of cultures. And so, you know, I grew up hearing a lot of different languages, and, you know, people don't think that when they think of Maine. You know, we're the whitest state in the nation for starters, but it's multicultural in a certain way because of the immigrant founding of these factory towns. So I grew up listening to the Lithuanian language. It was impenetrable to me, but this woman was, she was a very strong, we're actually terrified of her. She was a very strong, 4-square, tall woman. So there was her. And then I made a wonderful friend. I was doing a visiting writer gig at Colby College, which is about an hour and a half north of Portland, Maine, which is where I live. And I needed a place to stay just during the week so I could do my classes and be on campus. And I rented the upstairs of this old woman's house. And her name was Mary, and she was 89 years old when I first met her. And she died 11 years later at 98. And we were very dear friends. I mean, real friends, not just, you have this nice old lady that you're visiting. It was a very much a two-way street. And when she died, she was still driving. She was completely connected to life. Wow. I used to tell her that, I said, Mary, I'm taking notes on how to get there because you are doing this so right. And it turns out really I was probably making notes for this novel that I hadn't even thought about yet.
Okay, interesting. So that's the inspiration then for Ona Vitkus then.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool. So the boy, you mentioned the boy. I mean, the boy isn't named in the book, even though the other characters, like his dad Quinn, his mom Belle, Scoutmaster Ted Ledbetter, I believe his name is.
Yes, yeah.
Now, why didn't you name the kid? I mean, his influence is clearly obvious throughout the book. Why didn't you give him a name?
People have asked me that, and it's really funny because a lot of people are maybe halfway through the book and they realize, wait a minute, and they start turning back to think, well, what is this guy's name? He doesn't, and then they realize he has not been named. And the reason he does have a name, but I'm the only one who knows it.
Okay.
And I decided in the end that every time I tried to name him, he became sort of the world in a way that didn't feel right, because he is gone. He is more of a a presence in the book. He's kind of an absence that takes on a presence, is how I think of it. And every time I gave him an actual name, it felt like I was sort of like pinning a butterfly to the velvet cushion, that it just felt wrong to tether him to the living world in that way. So he just ended up nameless.
Okay. Well, I mean, it does come off pretty effectively. I mean, his influence is definitely felt throughout the book.
Yes.
Is the boy based on anyone you know, or anyone you met?
He is, it's funny. I have to say he's a little bit the way I was as a child. I was a list maker. I still do this. I just keep lists of words, just random words that please me. And I think people are going to say, oh, well, he's on the autism spectrum, or he has Asperger's, and he does appear that way. But when I started writing this book in 2005, and the word Asperger's wasn't even really very common in the American lexicon at that time. I knew what autism was, but we didn't say, oh, so-and-so is on the spectrum. It was kind of before we started doing that. And so the way I feel about him is he's just his own odd little self. He doesn't have a syndrome. He doesn't have, he's just a kind of an outlier. But he's just who he is, which is what his mother says about him at one point in the book. He's just who he is. And he reminds me of kids I've known, but honestly, there's a lot of myself in this little boy.
Okay, interesting. It's said, on the topic of characters, it's said that, authors write from their own personal experience. Like, there's usually a grain of truth behind all fiction. And that relates to characters as well. The other characters in your book, I mean, they don't come across as stereotypes or as two-dimensional cutouts, like...
Oh, thank you.
So they do come across real people. So are there any particular inspirations for these guys, like Quinn, Belle, Ted in particular?
Well, you're right. We do take little pieces of our lives, and I think of it sort of like crows on the roadside picking up shiny objects. And they put something together out of that. So there's no one who is, based on anybody in real life. But the Quinn's musicianship, I did the circuit earlier when I was in my 30s. For a few years, I did the bar circuit as a singer with a very good friend of mine who is an incredible guitar player. So we had this set that had everything in it, and we did everything from jazz to country western. I mean, he could play anything. So part of it is based on him, and he's still a working musician. And I have an older, but much older brother who, when I was 4 years old, he was 24 years old, and I can remember him. He was a country singer that he worked in the mill, but he was a working musician as well. And I remember him teaching me the words to Your Cheatin' Heart when I was 4 years old. So, musicians have been in the family, and we're kind of a musical family anyway. So, but as far as, that life on the road, it comes a little bit from my own experience, but much of it I borrowed from my friend, my guitar player friend.
Okay, cool. And what about the others, like Belle and Ted? Are they based on real people as well?
No, Ted he just arrived. He's just, he's a good guy, a good, decent guy. And Belle, no, not based on anybody, but, little, maybe a line she says, or, you never know where. It's hard, after the fact to go back and reconstruct where these people actually came from. It's such a fun process to put characters together, because you do take bits and pieces of either people or things you've overheard, or something you might have observed in an airport, or, it's just a matter of, weaving something together out of stray parts, really.
Right. Okay, cool. Got that. Got that. Very interesting. So, Monica, would you say that the setting is a character in itself in the book?
Do you know what's funny? Most of my books are set in, unsurprisingly, in small mill-town type places. But I've lived in Portland, Maine, it's a small city. It's only 65,000 people, with maybe 150,000 in the greater Portland metropolitan area. But it is the largest city in Maine, and it's actually a really interesting city. it's on all these lists now for best places to live and most
Right.
artistic and da da da. And we have a sizable immigrant population from Somalia and the Sudan and Southeast
Okay.
Asia. And so we have really good restaurants. We have interesting art and culture. We have a really active theater scene. We have a world-class symphony. There's just a lot here for such a small place. So we have a little bit of everything here. And this is my first, what I call my Portland novel. I set it in
Okay.
Portland.
Okay.
But honestly, it could be anywhere. It could be any small American city. And I feel that way too about my books that are set in small towns. And a lot of people, the book I had before this was a memoir called When We Were the Kennedys, and the subtitle is A Memoir from Mexico, Maine. And I went hither and yon for this book. I was in California and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and Ohio, and everywhere I went, people said to me, this is my story. It feels like my town. And it's because, America repeats itself from coast to coast.
Yeah.
There's such a similarity with these small cities. There's a real similarity with these small factory towns, which are now all dying. And so it's always interesting to me. I think as a writer, I need to set something in a place that I know well, because setting does become a bit of a character. So I wouldn't, I've never been to, say, where have I never been? I've never been to Los Angeles. So obviously I just don't feel as if I have the authority to set a novel in a place like Los Angeles because I've never been there, or, Berlin or someplace like that.
Right.
So you have to set it somewhere, and it has to be someplace because it's that authenticity. The reader feels as if he or she is in the hands of somebody who really literally knows the territory. But those territories are so transferable. This novel, as a matter of fact, is being published in many, many, many countries. And so it's clearly not a Portland, Maine novel. How could it be? It's being published in South Korea and Italy, and Turkey, and Brazil, and places like that. So there's something transferable about setting, particularly in this book, that I can't quite explain.
Okay, cool. Got that. Okay, so Monica, with a novel like this, it's very easy to fall into sentimentality. How do you keep
Yes, it is.
and how do you keep the emotional balance and emphasizing for the characters and the real life situations they're in without becoming, too sappy?
Yep. A lot of the reviews gratifyingly have said that very thing, that it never feels maudlin, or even though it's a very emotional novel, there's so much, but I think it's because the people feel so real. And for me, it really comes down to language. So if you are using, I teach this all the time as well.
Okay.
So, what you do is you try for nice, good, hard, seeable imagery instead of abstract concepts like sadness or tragedy, or instead you focus on things that people can see, like the flap of a little badge on a Boy Scout's chest, or there's one image in there where I could have said the boy was sweet and fragile and all kind of sort of abstract things, but instead I describe him. He's got a little leather jacket on, and it describes that on his father, it made his father look like a rock and roll man, but it made the boy look like a meerkat struggling out of a trap. So that's something you can see. And when the woman looks at his neck, coming out of that jacket, this little skinny white neck, she says he looks open to wounding. So it's things like that. You try to make images that the reader can kind of stop the reader in his tracks, and it just completely avoids the sentimentality because they're looking at something so unusual and very seeable. And it's when you fall into the abstractions of love and grief, people can't see it. Like if you say, oh, so and so cried a river of tears, it's like that just does nothing. You have to be seeing and hearing what that person is in that one moment.
Right. Okay. Well, that's an interesting technique. I mean, imagery and what you mentioned. Is this something that do you develop for yourself, or did you pick it up from someone else?
Oh, I think, one style develops over time. I think when you first start writing as a really apprentice, you sort of borrow things from writers that you admire. And then eventually you just become your own writer. And I've always been, I think, even as a kid, I think more of an imagistic writer, finding
Mm,
that one way to describe something that's startling or unusual, that avoids cliche or, as you say, sentimentality.
right.
And it is a
Right.
trick. It is technique. It's 10% inspiration and 90% is craft, just plain old craft, just as if you're learning to be a basketball player or a welder.
Mm-hmm.
There's a craft involved in writing. And when I go through, it takes me a really long time to write novels, and part of it is because I go through it sentence to sentence to sentence, paragraph
Mm,
to paragraph, making sure every sentence does what I want it to, that every sentence that can does more than one thing. So it can give information about what's happening in the plot, but also illuminate something about the character or the setting. And it's time consuming to make those double duty sentences
right.
sustain through an entire novel.
Right. Okay. So a lot of work. What I get is that there's a lot of work, really a lot of work that and intentionality that went into this.
Absolutely.
All right. Cool.
Yes, it doesn't come as a bolt out of the blue. The muse is a myth. She's just she's sitting on her backside most of the time, smoking cigarettes and watching TV. And every once in a while, she'll get up and come over and give you an idea, but not very often.
Okay. All right. Well, is there a special message that you want to deliver to the world through this book, or is this really just for the experience?
Well, how I always feel, honestly, about my books is I just want the reader to feel as if he or she has left his or her own life for a little while and
Hmm.
truly experienced someone else's life.
Hmm.
That they have walked in the shoes of these characters that feel very real to them. That's all I can really hope for. It's the most I hope for with fiction.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Interesting. Got that. Okay. Cool. So, is there anything else, Monica, other stories or topics like fiction or maybe even nonfiction that you want to explore in the future as an author?
Well, right now I'm working on my second play,
Okay.
and there's something about playwriting that really appeals to me. I've been a fiction writer for 25 years almost now,
Right.
and
Right.
you know, you spend a lot of time alone in a room typing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had my play produced last year, it was such a wonderful experience to be in a rehearsal room with actors and a director, everybody who's rowing the boat with me,
Mm-hmm.
who has just as much at stake with making it the best it can be as I do.
Right. Right.
It was a marvelous experience. We were in rehearsal for 4 weeks. This was a professional theater company. We were in rehearsal for 4 weeks, and I literally had my laptop and printer in the rehearsal room. So
Okay.
I
Okay.
was revising the play on the fly.
Uh huh.
It was
Uh huh.
so exciting. I felt so much less alone and in despair than I usually do when I'm working on something. So that was a really alluring experience. So I'm working on a draft of a new play now and hoping that that will be my next big project.
Cool. And here's to hoping that it becomes as successful as your first play.
Thank you.
All right. Cool. So, Monica, are there any last words of wisdom you would like to share to inspire listeners?
Well, I don't have words of wisdom, but I hope people will come to my website. I have a lot of
Okay.
different pages on there, and
All
there's
right.
writing tips on there and book
Okay.
recommendations, and
Okay.
so it'll be fun to have people come by and say hello.
Okay. So what sort of book recommendations do you have in your website?
I read all kinds of stuff, of course. So
Mm.
there's novels, there's nonfiction, history. Once in a while there'll be a book about football. I'm a huge football fan.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Okay. Cool.
yeah, there might be a book on writing or about writing. It's pretty varied. So if you're kind of in a reading slump, come on
Okay.
over and see what you can pick up.
Cool. Fantastic. Cool. Okay, so thank you very much, Monica. So, in closing, the book is The One in a Million Boy, author is our guest, Monica Wood. And you can check out her website, monicawood.com. You can get the book from there as well as all the other neat things that she just mentioned. So Monica, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for being on Author Story.
You are so welcome, Alex. Thank you.
This is cool. And to our audience, if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, go ahead and click the subscribe button. And if you like, go ahead and buy the book right now by going to the Amazon link in the video description below. We have now reached the end of our episode, so guys, so long for now. I'll be back next time on Author Story with another inspiring author.